The courtroom was alive with the usual hum of anticipation, lawyers rustling papers, spectators whispering in hushed tones, and the distant sound of a gavel striking in another chamber. Judge Monica Ellsworth sat at the bench, her gaze steady and professional. It was another day, another case. At least that's what she thought. The bailiff called the case, the state of Mississippi versus Brian Caldwell. Monica shifted slightly in her seat, her hands resting on the smooth walnut surface of the bench. She glanced at the file before her. Assault, armed theft, resisting an officer. A familiar weight settled in her chest, a mix of duty and sorrow. Just another person slipping through the cracks, she told herself. But when the accused was led in, shackles clinking with each step, her entire world shifted. The man standing before her wasn't a stranger. It was Brian Caldwell, her Brian. Her breath caught as a flood of memories surged forward. Those long golden afternoons they spent pedaling their bikes through the quiet streets of Natchez, Mississippi. Whispered secrets exchanged beneath the sycamore in her grandmother's yard. Vows made in youth to never lose touch, no matter where life took them. But the figure now standing before her wasn't the carefree boy etched in her heart. His back was stooped, his face carved with lines only hardship could explain. And still, his eyes, those hauntingly familiar eyes, were exactly the same. Monica's grip on the gavel loosened. For the first time in all her years on the bench, she hesitated. The room felt tighter, smaller, as the reality of the moment sank in. Brian lifted his eyes, and for a heartbeat, the air froze between them. Recognition sparked, then faded as he turned his gaze downward. The courtroom held its breath. Monica forced herself to speak. "Mr. Caldwell, you are charged with assault and armed robbery. How do you plead?" His voice, scratchy and worn, barely carried. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Her pulse thundered. She wanted to break form, to demand to know what had happened to him, to them. How had his life veered so far from what they dreamed? But her position called for restraint. "Proceed," she ordered, her tone firmer than she felt. As the prosecutor launched into opening remarks, Monica's thoughts whirled. This wasn't just another defendant. This was Brian, and somehow, she had to learn how to separate the boy who once knew her soul from the man in chains before her, before the lines between justice and memory blurred beyond repair. The room faded around her as her mind wandered to a time before courtrooms and gavels, when she and Brian had grown up on opposite ends of Natchez, not separated by miles, but by invisible walls built by a town that never truly welcomed everyone the same. Her family's house had been a modest single story with a pale blue picket fence, while Brian's family lived in a faded farmhouse at the far end of a gravel lane, surrounded by endless rows of crops. Their friendship had always defied expectations. She remembered the day they met, an accidental crossing at the bend of a creek where she had wandered too far past her backyard fence. Brian was struggling with his fishing line, knotted in the cattails. She had offered to help, and that single moment unraveled into years of secret escapes and unspoken dreams. "Monica," he had once said while they lay side by side on the grass beneath a velvet sky, "you ever think about leaving all this? Really getting out to a place where folks don't stare just 'cause we're sitting together?" She had laughed back then, dismissing it as childish wonder. But Brian wasn't playing. Even back then, he understood the world in a way she hadn't, the way it bent for some and broke others. Their bond only grew stronger, despite the murmurs, the judgmental stares, and the blunt warnings from both sides. Still, the weight of disapproval never left them. And then one day, everything changed. It was the summer before freshman year when Monica's father caught them chatting on the porch steps. His tone had been cold, laced with command. "Monica," inside. "Now." She had hesitated, meeting Brian's eyes, but he didn't flinch. "Go ahead," he said softly, resignation already in his voice. "I'll catch you later." But they never had that later. Her father banned her from seeing Brian, and not long after, his family packed up and moved out of Jackson. Monica buried herself in school, chasing grades, scholarships, and eventually the law. Her path had taken her far from that sleepy Mississippi town, but she never forgot the boy who taught her what quiet bravery looked like. Now, as she sat robed and resolute on the bench, she couldn't help but wonder what had happened to Brian after that day she stepped inside and left their world behind. His file showed a scattering of misdemeanors: trespassing, small-time theft, loitering, nothing that painted him as dangerous. But how much of a person's story could truly fit inside a case summary? The prosecutor's voice yanked her back to the present, outlining the accusation. Brian was being charged with assaulting a cashier during a holdup at a corner store in Mobile. The employee had sustained minor injuries, and the drawer had been wiped clean. Brian was arrested just 6 blocks from the scene, allegedly still holding the stolen cash. Eleanor studied James as the prosecutor spoke. His posture was slouched, his hands clasped in front of him, but his expression was unreadable. Did he really do it, or was there more to the story than what the prosecution claimed? The courtroom adjourned for a lunch break, giving Eleanor a moment to gather her thoughts. As she returned to her chambers, her assistant Denise approached with a cautious look. "Judge Ellsworth, are you all right? You seemed a little distracted?" Denise asked gently. Monica paused. Could she trust Denise with the truth? Would it be crossing a line to admit she once knew the defendant? Instead, she offered a practiced smile. "I'm fine, just a lot to process." But inside, she wasn't fine. How could she be when a piece of her past, one she thought had long faded, was now seated in front of her, awaiting her verdict? When court resumed, the gallery was even more crowded. Journalists scribbled frantically in notepads. The clerk organized folders. The prosecutor, a lean man with intense eyes named Thomas Radley, stood poised before the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," Radley began, his voice crisp and forceful, "this is a case about unprovoked violence. A man stormed into a small neighborhood store and, without warning, assaulted an unsuspecting employee before emptying the register and fleeing. The evidence will clearly show that Brian Caldwell committed this offense." Monica's stomach knotted. Radley's words were methodical, his delivery icy, as if Brian was just another file in the stack. She glanced toward Brian, who stared silently at the table, unmoved. The defense attorney, Caroline Maddox, stood next. She was younger than her opponent, but carried a quiet authority. "This case," she began, "is not as simple as the prosecution would have you believe. My client, Brian Caldwell, has consistently declared his innocence. We intend to show that there are serious flaws in the assumptions made that evening, and that the evidence will raise more questions than answers." The first witness called was a young clerk who'd been on duty during the incident. He recounted a man entering the store, exchanging harsh words with the cashier, and then suddenly leaping over the counter. His narrative was thorough, but something in his tone felt too polished. During cross-examination, Caroline moved with precision. "Mr. Miller, you testified that the individual who attacked the clerk was wearing a maroon sweatshirt, correct?" "That's right," the witness answered. "And did you see the person's face clearly?" "Not exactly. It was dim inside and the hood was pulled up." Caroline gave a slow nod, pacing thoughtfully across the floor. "So you're saying you couldn't definitively identify the individual who committed the assault?" "Well, no. But—" "No further questions," Caroline said, cutting him off smoothly. Monica noticed Brian shift slightly in his chair, his back straightening as though the brief exchange had sparked a flicker of hope. The next item entered into evidence was a surveillance video from the store. The footage, shaky and dim, showed a figure clad in a burgundy hoodie stepping into the frame. The prosecution asserted that the person was Brian, but the poor resolution made it nearly impossible to pick out any facial details. As the video played on the screen, Monica leaned in, studying every movement. Could this really be Brian? The figure darted toward the counter, gesturing aggressively, then vanished from view. The clip cut out suddenly, leaving behind more questions than clarity. Brian's defense hinged on an alibi. He claimed to have been walking home from a friend's house during the incident, but the friend refused to testify, citing concerns about backlash from others in the neighborhood. Caroline insisted that a fearful witness did not equate to a guilty defendant, but the subtle shifts in the jury's expressions suggested doubt. As the proceedings dragged on, Monica felt the immense pressure of her role tightening around her like a vice. She was expected to be neutral, unwavering, a symbol of fairness. But how could she be, when every look, every word, pulled her back to a simpler time, when Brian was the boy who had once meant everything to her? That boy was now a man in chains, and she, the judge, was the one tasked with overseeing the process that could determine the rest of his life. When court recessed for the evening, Monica remained seated at the bench, her fingertips running lightly along the gavel's edge. She ached to speak to Brian, to ask him plainly what had really happened, but that line couldn't be crossed. Any private contact would compromise the trial and her career. As she watched the officers lead Brian away in cuffs, her confidence faltered. She had spent her life believing that justice, if pursued earnestly, always found the truth. But in that moment, she wasn't so sure. The air in the courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the defense began to present its central argument. Caroline Maddox called her key witness, Officer Marcus Delaney, the officer who made the arrest. Monica's attention sharpened. If there were weaknesses in the case, they might emerge here. Officer Delaney, broad-shouldered with a curt presence, settled into the witness chair. Caroline approached with calm precision. "Officer Delaney," she began evenly, "you were the one who took Mr. Caldwell into custody, is that correct?" "That's correct," he responded, his tone tight and businesslike. "You stated in your report that Mr. Caldwell was walking about 3 blocks from the scene of the robbery when you detained him, correct?" "Yes." "And what specifically led you to believe he was the suspect?" Delaney shifted slightly in his seat. He fit the description. African-American male, early 40s, dressed in dark clothes. Caroline's brows arched. Dark clothing. But the individual in the footage was said to be wearing a crimson hoodie. "Did you recover such a hoodie when you searched Mr. Caldwell?" Delaney hesitated. "No, but he could have ditched it." Caroline stepped forward. "Could have? Did you, or any responding officer, conduct a thorough search of the surrounding area to find this alleged sweatshirt?" Delaney's jaw clenched. "No, we didn't have the time. He was apprehended fast." Caroline pressed on. "Just to be clear, you detained my client based on a vague profile and without any direct physical evidence connecting him to the robbery." The silence from the officer echoed louder than words. Monica's eyes flicked to the jury. Several jurors exchanged looks, doubt creeping in. Caroline continued, "Officer Delaney, do you recall if Mr. Caldwell said anything when you arrested him?" He objected, said he hadn't done anything. "And did you investigate that claim, or did you presume guilt based on appearance alone?" A flush crept up Delaney's neck. "I followed procedure." "Procedure?" Caroline repeated with a trace of disbelief. "No further questions, Your Honor." As Delaney stepped down, the courtroom stirred with low murmurs. His credibility had taken a visible hit. Monica's heartbeat quickened. This was no longer just about a robbery. It was about a system that too often reached conclusions before questions were asked. The defense's next move caught everyone off guard. Caroline called a forensic video analyst to the stand. The expert testified that the individual in the store video couldn't be definitively matched to Brian based on build or height. And what's more, the timestamp on the footage had been modified, casting doubt on its validity. The prosecution objected, attempting to frame the testimony as speculative, but the jury looked visibly unsettled. A shift had occurred. Doubt hung in the air like smoke. As the day neared its end, Brian was given the option to speak. Caroline had warned him of the risks, but he was firm. He rose, chains clinking faintly, and walked to the witness stand. When he spoke, his voice was soft but clear, laced with raw honesty. "I've made mistakes," he began, looking each juror in the eye. "I've messed up, trusted people I shouldn't have, but I didn't do what I'm accused of doing that night. I was heading home, just keeping to myself, when the officers stopped me. They didn't ask anything. They just looked at me and decided I fit what they were looking for." His voice trembled slightly as he went on. "I've spent my whole life trying to be seen for who I am, not what people expect or assume. But now, I'm worn out. I just want the truth to mean something again." Monica felt a knot rise in her throat as Brian returned to his seat. His words didn't just echo in the silence. They resonated with something deeper, a call for dignity, not just a verdict. She looked to the jury box. Their expressions varied. Some furrowed in doubt, others softened by empathy. This was the moment. The truth was no longer contained in exhibits or statements. It had become a question of principle, a test of fairness, against long-held bias. Monica understood then that her job wasn't only to enforce the law, but to embody its purpose. Justice with compassion. The final day of proceedings arrived cloaked in tension. Both sides gave their closings with care and calculation. Prosecutor Radley leaned heavily on what little evidence they had, urging the jury to believe in the system's procedures. Caroline, however, appealed to something deeper, asking them to look beyond assumptions and consider the cracks in the story and the man behind the charges. Monica maintained her neutral expression, but her thoughts churned beneath the surface. She couldn't influence the jurors, but if they returned a verdict that left ambiguity, she would hold the responsibility to guide justice forward. That weight pressed on her like never before. Hours passed as the jury deliberated. The courtroom emptied and refilled with the quiet energy of waiting, people stretching, whispering, pacing. Brian sat still, hands folded tight, his eyes downcast. He hadn't glanced Monica's way since the first session, and she didn't expect him to. What words could she possibly offer that would undo years of distance, or this trial? At last, the bailiff stood and called for order. The jury had reached a decision. The room fell into a hush as the foreperson rose, a small paper shaking slightly in her grip. "In the case of the state of Mississippi versus Brian Caldwell, we find the defendant." Another heartbeat passed, not guilty. A wave of reactions rippled through the crowd, gasps, low murmurs, even scattered applause. Monica raised her gavel and struck for silence. Brian's shoulders sank, as if something heavy had finally fallen away, though his expression remained guarded. Freedom had been returned to him, but not without a price. Monica addressed the court, her voice clear and composed. "The jury has spoken, Mr. Caldwell. You are free to go. Court is adjourned." As the courtroom gradually cleared, Monica remained seated, her eyes following Brian as he moved to sign the paperwork that would set him free. For a moment, she thought he might simply walk out without looking back. But then he paused, turned, and approached the bench. The room was nearly empty now, just a couple of clerks gathering folders and Denise collecting files into her satchel. Brian stopped a few paces from her, his expression guarded, yet open. "You didn't owe me anything," he said softly. "But I need to ask. Why didn't you say something? You knew who I was." Monica felt her chest tighten, the explanation sticking in her throat. "Because I couldn't," she said, voice low. "I had to stay impartial. If I had acknowledged it, the whole case could have unraveled." Brian studied her for a beat, his face torn between disappointment and reluctant understanding. "Impartial," he echoed. "That's the thing, Monica. The world's never been impartial, not for people like me." She lowered her gaze to the polished bench beneath her hands and gave a slow nod. "You're right. I wish I had spoken up back then. I wish I could have done more, both then and now." Brian let out a long breath, and some of the weight in his shoulders seemed to lift. "We were just kids," he said. "We didn't know the rules. But you do now, don't you?" "I do," she replied quietly, but with conviction. "And I'm sorry." Brian gave a faint nod, then turned and walked toward the exit, his steps steady, his back straight as he disappeared through the doors into the fading day. Monica remained in her seat, the echo of his words lingering like a question, without an easy answer. She had fulfilled her duty, upheld the law, but something deeper had been laid bare. Justice, she realized, wasn't only about facts and procedures. It was about the people caught beneath the weight of systems they never asked to be born into. It wasn't just about winning or losing in court. It was about dignity, about history, about change. As she stepped outside into the golden light of early evening, the shadows long across the courthouse steps, Monica made a quiet promise. She couldn't rewrite what had been lost, but she would spend whatever time she had left trying to shape what could still be saved. It wouldn't be easy, maybe it wouldn't be enough, but for Brian and for herself, she would try.